It is my opinion that historians tend to give short shrift to culture. We tend to talk about wars and battles, politics, science, and technology while ignoring the fact that the true flow of history is the question of how people have changed the way that we live our lives over time. The culture wars, that natural give and take, have often served as agents of cultural change, but also as moderators of those change. And debates over culture, what behaviors should and should not be allowed, have been the most contentious in American history, and still are, to this day. At the turn of the century, the world was facing a host of changes: industrialization, mechanization, and a transformation in the role of women in society, and not everybody was always on board with all those changes. The culture war came to a head in New York City in 1908 when the New York City Board of Aldermen passed an ordinance making it illegal for women to smoke in public, raising a debate that seems at once both remarkably anachronistic and shockingly familiar today. It is history that deserves to be remembered. New York at the turn of the century was a city of enormous growth. The city had added more than 1 million people between 1880 and 1890, another million between 1890 and 1900, and would add 1 million more by 1910. The growth was due in part to immigration and the city's growing importance as a center of trade and capital, but also as a result of consolidation. The 5 boroughs of Brooklyn, Manhattan, the Bronx, Queens, and Staten Island had been united in 1898. The city had a growing sense of importance and pride, as noted in an article on the webpage of the Library of Congress. The great waves of European immigrants coming to New York, the consolidation of the 5 boroughs into one vast city, the development of the city's infrastructure, and the incredible construction boom of the next 30 years all contributed to the city's prominence. Commenting on a collection of early films of the city, the webpage notes, the best of these films conveyed the sense that the already sprawling city was in the process of becoming something much more than a squalid, chaotic urban center. There are skyscrapers going up, the tallest in the world, a great suspension bridge being opened, the largest in the world, and a new subway system, the longest in the world. Notably, the city had dramatically improved sanitation, largely due to the efforts of the extraordinary sanitary engineer, Colonel George E. Waring, who had been hired by the city in 1895 to deal with, among other things, the around estimated 2.5 million pounds of manure, 600,000 gallons of urine deposited in the city streets by horses every single day. Through a combination of new ordinances and the establishment of a new street cleaning department, Waring had transformed a city that, in the 19th century, had been known as much for the hogs wandering its streets as its urban nature. And all of this was ruled by the New York City Board of Aldermen. Derived from the historic Common Council, the Board of Aldermen had been established as part of what was originally a bicameral governing board in 1824. Under the city charter of 1901, the city was governed by a single body. The president of the Board of Aldermen was elected citywide and presided over a board of 73 borough presidents. Being New York City, much of this board was controlled by machine politics, including 2 notable Tims. There is some disagreement over whether Timothy P. Sullivan was born in Boston or New York City, but at any rate, the New York Times explains the boy was in New York, down on the East Side, scratching around for himself when he was just 10 years old. He took an interest in law and eventually became a lawyer, although the Times notes there is no information about the university class with which he was graduated. He came upon his nickname Little Tim by coincidence, given that he was not, the Times explains, a physically small man by any means. Rather, when he came from Boston, he found a good many Sullivans already here. One of these was a cousin, Timothy D., 7 or 8 years older. Timothy D. was a physically large man who came to be known as Big Tim or Big Fella, and Timothy P., who shared the same name, therefore came to be known as Little Tim. Both, however, would have an outsized role in New York City politics, as leaders of the machine politics of Tammany Hall, the Times explains. Being Irish, they took to politics naturally. And being Irish, they succeeded in New York City politics extremely well. The 2 Tims derived their political power from the Bowery, a borough in the southern part of Manhattan. The New York Times said of Little Tim in 1909, he was the leader of the most powerful Tammany district on the East Side, majority leader in the Board of Aldermen, with all the powers those important places carry with them. While there were various accusations of various kinds of corruption, the Times said of him, his wit was keen, his industry a model to other assemblymen, his judgment cool and quick, and his parliamentary training complete. As to his political philosophy, he wrote of the job of an alderman. He knows everybody's troubles and is expected to remedy them as far as he is able. And in 1908, there were troubles to be had. While the Tims were both supporters of the growing demand for women's suffrage, there were certainly points where the transforming role of women in society caused concern. This shock of transformation was demonstrated at a fashion show in Paris in 1908. Author Laura Casely explains on the website Little Things. For centuries, women squeezed themselves into tight-fitting undergarments that whittled their waist into hourglass shapes, and often resulted in organ and bone deformities along the way. They also tended to wear lots of layers, both for warmth and propriety. But designer Jean-Marjan Lacroix shocked the world when, at the fashion event in Paris, she showed slinky dresses that left very little to the imagination. Worst of all, it was evident that underneath was no underwear at all, something that, along with its low neckline and split skirt, was shocking, even in Paris. That's right, in 1908, even Paris was scandalized by the very idea that a woman might go out in public without being tied into a corset. Casely continues, the fashion soon spread out of France and into other parts of Europe, and stories of distracted men crashing their carriages soon followed. This was the sort of social challenge faced by Little Tim and the Board of Aldermen in the turn-of-century New York City. The most shocking revelation came when the New York Times reported on December 30th, 1907, that James B. Martin, proprietor of Café Martin, let it be known that on New Year's Eve all ladies may smoke cigarettes in any of the rooms of the restaurant at 26th Street and 5th Avenue, and that this privilege may become permanent thereafter. And the idea was not limited to Café Martin. A January 2nd, 1908 story in the Times reported that Rector's restaurant would also allow ladies to smoke, and that a canvass of the city's prominent restaurants by a Times reporter yesterday revealed that the proprietors were inclined to grant women permission to please themselves. Martin opined, personally, I think New York is ready to allow ladies to smoke in good restaurants. But little Tim Sullivan was not so sure. The issue of women smoking at all was relatively new. While paper-wrapped tobacco had been used in Europe at least since the 16th century, and the name cigarette had been coined in France around 1830, ready-made cigarettes were an expensive luxury item, and the cigarettes didn't grow in popularity until 1881, when American inventor James Albert Bonsack revolutionized the cigarette industry by patenting a cigarette rolling machine that could produce more than 200 cigarettes a minute. Oddly, given that the health dangers of smoking were already being realized, cigarettes were being referred to as coffin nails as early as 1888, the act of smoking was a sign of defiance and independence for women seeking to expand women's roles in society. When in 1904, a New York City bicycle policeman asked that two women in an open car extinguish their cigarettes, saying, "You can't do that on Fifth Avenue while I'm patrolling here," the woman, one Mrs. William P. Orr, according to the New York Times, drew in a quantity of the smoke from the cigarette and then exhaled it in the policeman's face. Notably, the smoking drew no charges, but one of the men in the car was arrested for being drunk and disorderly. For her part, the woman told the paper, "I don't see that I was doing any harm." But the prospect of women being allowed to smoke openly in public establishments was a problem for little Tim Sullivan, a man that a January 6, 1908 edition of the newspaper The San Francisco Call called the Bowery Moralist and Political Chieftain. The paper reported nothing so shocked little Tim as the order sent out around Christmas time to the effect that women would be allowed to smoke at Martin's famous French restaurant on Broadway and one or two other hostelries frequented by persons with liberal ideas. The trend was disturbing. The Washington, D.C. Evening Star lamented, since the new Plaza Hotel opened, and particularly since the orgy of New Year's Eve in the Fifth Avenue Broadway hotels and restaurants were described in graphic language in the newspapers, there's been an epidemic of cigarette smoking among young women all over New York. Little Tim responded on January 20th. The New York Times reported on the 21st. After today, it will be against the law for a hotel or restaurant proprietor or anyone else owning or managing a public place to allow women to smoke in public. The proposal for the Sullivan Ordinance came in a brief hearing in the Committee of Laws of the Board of Aldermen. The ordinance, the paper explained, does not make it an offense for a woman to smoke, but it does make it an offense for the manager or proprietor of a public place to allow her to smoke therein, and for doing so he may suffer the revocation of his license and also be fined. The proposal was not without opposition. When he spoke on behalf of his own ordinance, Sullivan admitted that he had never seen women smoking in the public places in his district. Alderman Charles Pease tried to amend the law to prohibit anyone smoking in a public place, not to make the law consistent, but because any woman present ought not be forced to inhale tobacco fumes. Alderman John Henry Smith argued that it would be much better for the board to concern itself with the hardships of the poor than with such nonsensical things as smoking by a few women in a restaurant. Aldermen Brown and Duell argued the ordinance was unconstitutional. Yet despite the objections, the Times reported that the ordinance would pass the Board of Aldermen without the slightest doubt. And in fact, it passed unanimously, without objection, in a roll call vote. The Rochester, New York Democrat and Chronicle was aghast. Several aldermen have contended, and Sullivan has admitted that it is unconstitutional. Why the latter wanted it pass is a mystery. Why the other city fathers should meekly fall in line is not clear. The Evening Star explained, he dominates the Tammany majority in the Board of Aldermen, and no ordinance can pass that body without his approval. While on the other hand, whatever he says, goes. Hence, when little Tim Sullivan's ordinance forbidding hotels, restaurants, and cafe owners to allow women to smoke in their public rooms was offered, nobody voted against it. The Democrat and Chronicle complained, for some reason known to themselves, they deemed it advisable to permit him to have his joke with the Board of Aldermen. Even in the sensibilities of the day, the sexism of the ordinance was not missed. An editorial in the New York Evening World noted, they say that it is wrong for women to smoke in public places, that it is offensive for those who look on and detrimental to the character and dignity of the fair sex. Who say and do this? Why, the lords of creation. Men. The editorial, however, carries the great cause of the women's movement at the time, prohibition. Why does he stop her, the editorial asked, from a little evil like smoking in public, when there's a greater, a viler, a more scandalizing evil which he can and should remedy, mighty and gifted lawmaker that he is? And that is drinking in public. The Chicago Tribune noted that women who opposed the passage of Little Tim's ordinance found unexpected support in the form of two women newly arrived in New York, Lady Juliet Duff and Miss Violet Vivian, both ladies-in-waiting to Queen Alexandra, wife of Edward VII. Noting that fully one-half of the women on their voyage to the United States were seen smoking, it's not right, they said. Women should be allowed the same privileges as men. The New York Times noted that neither woman had ever heard of reformer Little Tim, and that neither appeared to be much impressed with what they heard. But there were plenty who were willing to support the new ordinance. Responding to a letter asking if smoking be a vice, is it not vice equally vicious in both sexes? The editors of the Buffalo Inquirer said, just put your mind on the woman who stands out purest and noblest in your memory, your own mother, presumably. Does she not think it indecent for a woman to smoke in public? Would she not think so if she were living? Would you not hate to see her smoking anywhere? With no apparent shame in lecturing as the lords of creation, the editors go on to say, we think it is indecent that women would smoke in restaurants or anywhere else in public. And you think so too, although you probably don't know that you think so. That's not a line I would try on your wife. Even the Democrat and Chronicle, while calling the ordinance Little Tim's bad joke, opined, these remarks must not be construed as expressing approval of women, lovely or otherwise, smoking in public. We don't like to see them do it. But, they continue, we rather object to them wearing plug hats, flourishing canes, leading gorgeously uniformed dogs through the streets, or making suffragette speeches to scoffing multitudes in business districts of a town. But laws against such things are silly. The first test of the law came on January 22nd. The New York Times reports that a policeman Stern had seen a woman calmly take a cigarette from a package and light it, striking a match on a house wall. Madam, you mustn't, he shouted. What would Alderman Sullivan say? When taken to court, 29-year-old Katie Mulcahy said, I've never heard of this new law, and I don't want to hear about it. No man shall dictate to me. Despite the ordinance not outright banning women smoking in public and not including any provision for a fine if they did, Mulcahy was fined $5, which she refused to pay. The Times reported, in default of $5 to pay the fine, she went to a cell, carrying her package of cigarettes. Miss Mulcahy was the only person ever penalized under the Sullivan Ordinance. Mayor George McClellan Jr. vetoed the law on February 4th, saying, I know of no provision of law which gives the Board of Aldermen the power to enact an ordinance of this kind. Some papers implied that Mayor McClellan was courting women voters in anticipation of women's suffrage. The mayor's veto didn't end the controversy over women smoking in public, and the supposed connection between women smoking and loose morals continued for decades after. But the veto did say something about the limits of the Board of Aldermen's power. When the board tried to ban women smoking again 3 years later, the city's legal officer declared it against the law. The move spurred the board to seek legal counsel to aid the board on understanding its own legal authority. The Board of Aldermen was replaced by a smaller city council in 1937. The entire heated debate over the Sullivan Ordinance seems almost ridiculous today, not just in the patronizing attitude towards women, which would result in you end up sleeping on the couch today, but also in the attitude towards cigarettes, especially following the 1964 Surgeon General's report about the effects of cigarettes on smoking during pregnancy, which led to the mandate that all cigarette packages have a Surgeon General's warning on them. Citing the effects of secondhand smoke, it's been illegal to smoke in restaurants in New York City since 1995. Seems almost bizarre today that there was once a fight to allow exactly that. And of course, the debate over government regulation both of public morality and personal health choices still rages on today. And it raises the question of why little Tim Sullivan pushed this ordinance at all, given that the Tammany Democrats tended to be rather liberal socially and were supporters of women's suffrage. But you have to understand, it wasn't about gender or sex. It was about class. As the Evening Star noted, the argument was that the tendency of the submerged majority to imitate the follies and vices of upper tendom is well known and appreciated. Realizing the consequences to the young women of his class who might acquire the habit, he'd undertaken to check it by forbidding women to smoke in public places. That is, little Tim at least wanted to be seen as protecting his working class constituents from the corrupting influence of the rich. Yet another debate that still rages on today. Be sure and join us in the History Guy Guild at thehistoryguyguild.locals.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history. And if you did enjoy, feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please send those to our suggestions email box. Check out our webpage at thehistoryguy.net. And of course, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo and check out our merchandise at teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.